Algorithm-driven social media, Part 1, The Inner Child. Today we're exploring a topic that sits at the crossroads of psychology, technology, and societal well-being: how algorithm-driven social media environments shape developmental vulnerability and emotional sustainability in modern societies. Part 1, The Inner Child. To help us unpack this, we're joined by Thor Sivert Fritland, a writer and commentator who has been raising concerns about the developmental impact of digital platforms on children and adolescents. Thor's recent analysis draws on both contemporary developmental science and the work of Dr. David R. Hawkins, an American psychiatrist known for framing narcissism not as a character flaw, but as a form of developmental stagnation rooted in unmet emotional needs and disrupted self-regulation. Thor, thank you for being here.
Thank you for having me. When I talk about Dr. David R. Hawkins, I'm not just talking about a psychiatrist or a researcher. I'm talking about someone who tried to map the inner landscape of being human. Hawkins spent more than 50 years in clinical psychiatry, running one of the largest practices in the United States. And yet, what he's remembered for isn't the size of his clinic. It's the depth of his insight. He had this rare ability to look at the human mind not as a collection of symptoms, but as a spectrum of consciousness, a continuum of awareness, integrity, and emotional maturity. His map of consciousness wasn't meant to be a rigid system. It was an attempt to describe the evolution of the self, from fear and shame all the way up to compassion, love, and clarity.
What strikes you much about Hawkins?
And what strikes me is that Hawkins never separated science from spirit. He co-authored work with Linus Pauling, lectured at Harvard and Notre Dame, and contributed to early research on nutritional psychiatry. But he also spoke about healing, meaning, and the inner life with a kind of grounded sincerity that made people listen. To me, Hawkins represents a bridge between psychology and philosophy, between clinical practice and human potential. He understood that emotional development isn't just a private journey, it's the foundation for how we show up in the world, how we relate to others, and how we build societies that can sustain empathy and resilience. So, when I drew Hawkins today, it's because he saw something essential, that the greatest challenges we face aren't just technological or political, they're developmental. They're about the maturity of the human heart. And in a world shaped by algorithms and constant stimulation, his voice feels more relevant than ever.
Thor, before we move further into global collaboration, I want to pause on something foundational. Hawkins was especially known for his synaptic mind. What does this mean?
It's a beautiful question, because the synaptic mind is one of the most misunderstood aspects of Hawkins' genius. When people hear the term, they often think it means a mind with many interests or a mind that sees connections. And while that's partly true, it doesn't capture the depth of what Hawkins meant. The synaptic mind is the ability to hold multiple domains of reality, scientific, psychological, philosophical, spiritual, in a single, coherent frame. It's not just interdisciplinary thinking. It's integrative consciousness.
So, it's not about collecting information, it's about synthesizing it?
Exactly. Hawkins didn't just gather knowledge, he wove it. He could look at psychiatric symptoms, spiritual principles, a neurological pattern, and a philosophical question, and see the underlying structure that connected them. Most people think of vertical silos. Hawkins thought horizontally and vertically at the same time. He could zoom out to see the whole system, then zoom in to understand the smallest detail without losing coherence.
Almost like he could see the architecture behind the architecture.
Yes, that's the perfect way to put it. The synaptic mind sees the blueprint beneath the blueprint. It sees the pattern beneath the pattern. And here's the part that matters for our conversation. The synaptic mind is exactly what we need to understand the developmental crisis of the digital age. Because this crisis isn't just neurological. It's not just psychological. It's not just technological. It's not just cultural. It's all of them, simultaneously.
So, Hawkins' way of thinking becomes a model on how we should approach this problem.
Absolutely. If we try to solve this with only neuroscience, we miss the identity dimension. If we use only psychology, We miss the algorithmic architecture. If we use only policy, we miss the developmental science. If we use only spirituality, we miss the structural forces shaping consciousness. The synoptic mind says, you cannot fix a multi-layered problem with a single-layered solution.
And that's why your Global Developmental Alliance needs so much discipline.
Exactly. Because the synoptic mind isn't just a personal trait, it's a societal necessity. We need a collective synoptic mind, a way of thinking that integrates neuroscience, developmental psychology, technology design, public policy, education, cultural norms, emotional literacy, and even philosophical insight. Hawkins understood that consciousness is systemic, development is systemic, and the forces shaping children today are systemic. So, our response must be systemic too,
How does this apply to children and teens themselves?
in a profound way. The synoptic mind is not just a cognitive ability, it's a developmental achievement. It emerges when the self is stable enough to integrate complexity. But algorithmic environments fragment attention, fragment identity, fragment emotional regulation. Fragmentation is the opposite of synaptic integration. So, if we want a generation capable of synaptic thinking, capable of seeing the whole, not just the parts, we must protect the developmental conditions that allow the mind to integrate.
So, the synoptic mind is both the model and the goal.
Yes, it's the compass and the destination. It's how we understand the problem and how we imagine the solution.
Thor, this is extraordinary. I'd like to continue next with how the synoptic mind can guide the design of future technologies that don't fragment consciousness but support integration.
I'm ready. Because if we can design technology that strengthens the synoptic mind instead of weakening it, we change the trajectory of an entire generation.
Thor, before the break, you said something striking that Hawkins' work isn't just historically interesting, but essential for understanding the psychological challenges of the digital age. Can you expand on that?
Absolutely. Hawkins understood something fundamental about human development, that emotional maturity depends on building an inner center of gravity, a place inside yourself that isn't constantly swayed by external approval, fear, or comparison. Now look at the digital world we've created. It's built on the opposite principle. Everything is externalized: identity, validation, self-worth, even emotional regulation. Social media trains the mind to outsource its stability to metrics and reactions. Hawkins would say that's a recipe for developmental stagnation.
Because the self never learns to regulate from within?
Exactly. Hawkins believed that narcissistic patterns emerge when the self is underdeveloped, when it hasn't learned to tolerate vulnerability, uncertainty, or emotional discomfort. And what do algorithmic platforms do? They eliminate discomfort. They eliminate silence. They eliminate the slow, difficult work of building an inner life. Instead, they offer constant stimulation, constant feedback, constant distraction. It's like emotional fast food. It fills you, but it doesn't nourish you.
So, Hawkins gives us a framework for understanding why digital overstimulation is more than just a lifestyle issue, it's a developmental one.
Exactly. He helps us see that the danger isn't just too much screen time. It's the way these systems shape the architecture of the self. If a child learns that their emotional equilibrium depends on how others respond to them online, then the inner regulatory system, the one Hawkins saw as essential for emotional maturity, never fully develops. And that's not just an individual problem. It becomes a societal one,
How so?
because emotional immaturity doesn't stay private. It spills into relationships, workplaces, politics, public discourse. A society full of people who are easily triggered, chronically insecure, or dependent on external validation becomes harder to govern, harder to unify, harder to sustain. Hawkins believed that higher levels of consciousness, compassion, integrity, empathy are only possible when the self is stable. If we undermine that stability at scale, we undermine the emotional foundation of society.
So, in a way, Hawkins predicted the psychological fault lines of the digital era.
Yes. He didn't know about TikTok or Instagram, but he understood the human psyche well enough to see what happens when emotional development is interrupted. And that's why his work matters now more than ever. It gives us a language and a warning for what happens when technology evolves faster than the human nervous system.
Thor, this is powerful. I'd love to continue next with what a healthier, development supportive digital environment might look like.
I'm ready. Because the point isn't to reject technology, it's to redesign it so it strengthens the self instead of hollowing it out. I think we're at a point where the digital environment has become so deeply woven into childhood that we can't treat social media as a neutral communication tool anymore. It's a developmental ecosystem, one that's shaped by algorithms designed to trigger the most reactive parts of the human brain.
And that's where Hawkins becomes relevant.
Exactly. Hawkins argued that narcissistic traits emerge when the self doesn't develop adequate emotional integration. In his view, a person becomes dependent on external validation because the internal regulatory systems never fully matured. When you look at social media through that lens, it becomes clear that these platforms are engineered to reinforce the very patterns Hawkins described: overstimulation, constant comparison, and emotional reactivity.
So, you're suggesting that social media doesn't just reflect developmental vulnerabilities, it amplifies them?
Yes, and especially in children. Their brains are still wiring the systems responsible for self regulation, frustration tolerance, and emotional stability. When they grow up in an environment that rewards impulsiveness, visibility, and instant feedback, it can shape their identity formation in ways we're only beginning to understand. This isn't about blaming kids. It's about recognizing that the environment is structurally tilted toward dysregulation.
You've used the term societal emotional sustainability. What does that mean in this context?
It refers to a society's long-term capacity to maintain empathy, relational depth, and emotional resilience across generations. If large numbers of young people grow up in systems that normalize self-focus, emotional volatility, and constant comparison, that affects how we relate to one another, how we handle conflict, and even how we participate in democracy. Emotional sustainability is as important as environmental sustainability. We just talk about it far less.
And do you believe this is something policymakers need to address?
Absolutely. Legislators are overwhelmed with information, so issues like this don't rise to the surface unless experts, parents, researchers, and organizations speak with a unified voice. This isn't moral panic. It's prevention. It's public health. If we know that algorithmic systems can shape developmental trajectories, then we have a responsibility to examine whether current regulations protect children's rights and long-term well-being.
Thor, this is a powerful and timely perspective. Thank you for sharing it.
Thank you. I think the more we talk about this openly, the better chance we have of building a digital environment that supports, not undermines, healthy development.
Thor, I'd like to go deeper into something you touched on earlier: the idea that algorithmic platforms don't just influence individual behavior, but shape the emotional architecture of a whole generation. How do you see that playing out over time?
I think we're already seeing early signs. When children grow up in systems that reward immediacy, visibility, and emotional intensity, they internalize those patterns as normal. Over time, that can shift what a society considers baseline behavior. If emotional reactivity becomes the norm, then patience, nuance, and reflective thinking become the exception. And that has consequences, not just for individuals, but for how communities function.
That sounds like a kind of cultural rewiring.
Exactly. Hawkins talked about how unresolved emotional development leads to compensatory behaviors, seeking control, external validation, or constant stimulation. Now imagine those tendencies being reinforced not just by personal history, but by the entire digital environment. We're not just dealing with individual developmental stagnation, we're dealing with structural conditions that can produce it at scale.
So, does the environment become a multiplier?
Yes, and that's what makes this so urgent. A child who is already vulnerable may be due to prenatal stress, early instability, or lack of emotional scaffolding, enters a digital world that amplifies those vulnerabilities. But even children who start out with strong developmental foundations are shaped by platforms that reward the least regulated parts of the human psyche.
That's a powerful point. It suggests that the issue isn't limited to at-risk children, it's systemic.
Right. And that's why I talk about societal emotional sustainability. If we normalize environments that undermine emotional regulation, we risk creating a culture where empathy, patience, and relational depth become harder to sustain. This isn't about blaming technology. It's about recognizing that design choices have psychological consequences.
Let's bring Hawkins back into this. How do his ideas help us understand what's happening?
Hawkins believed that emotional maturity depends on developing an inner stability, a sense of self that isn't constantly seeking external reinforcement. Social media, however, is built on the opposite principle. It trains the mind to look outward for validation, to measure itself through metrics, to react rather than reflect. So, if you combine Hawkins' developmental model with modern algorithmic design, you get a perfect storm, a system that both exploits and reinforces immature emotional patterns.
And what does that mean for the future?
It means we need to think long term. If we want a society capable of cooperation, empathy, and democratic resilience, we can't ignore the emotional ecosystems children are growing up in. We regulate physical environments, food safety, pollution, and product standards because we know they affect health. Emotional environments are no different. They shape the kind of humans we become.
So, this becomes a question of collective responsibility?
Absolutely. Parents can't solve this alone. Teachers can't solve it alone. Even tech companies can't solve it alone. This is a societal issue that requires political will, scientific insight, and cultural awareness. And it starts with acknowledging that children's emotional development is not a private matter, it's public good.
Thor, I'd like to turn more directly to Hawkins' understanding of narcissism. He didn't see it as a personality defect in the traditional sense, but as a developmental interruption, a kind of emotional unfinishedness. How does that perspective help us understand what's happening in today's digital environment?
Hawkins' framing is incredibly useful here. He believed narcissism emerges when the self doesn't fully develop the capacity for inner regulation. Instead of having a stable internal center, the person becomes dependent on external cues, approval, attention, control, to feel emotionally balanced. Now look at social media. It's a system built entirely on external cues. Likes, views, comments, shares. It's a constant stream of microvalidation. For a developing mind, that can become the emotional equivalent of fast food.
So, does the platform become a substitute for the inner regulatory system that never fully formed?
Exactly. Hawkins would say that when a child doesn't get enough attuned, stable emotional feedback in early life, the self becomes fragile. It can't regulate from within, so it learns to regulate from without. Social media is the perfect environment for that kind of compensatory strategy. It offers endless opportunities to seek validation, to curate identity, to control how others see you. But it never builds the inner structure that real emotional maturity requires.
And that's where the developmental vulnerability comes in?
Yes, children and adolescents are in the middle of wiring the neural circuits responsible for emotional regulation. If those circuits are constantly bypassed, if the child learns to soothe anxiety or uncertainty through external feedback loops, then the deeper developmental work doesn't happen. Hawkins would call that a stagnation point. The self stops maturing because it's found a shortcut.
A shortcut that looks like connection but isn't connection.
Right. It's pseudo-connection. It mimics the structure of social interaction, but without the emotional depth, reciprocity, or vulnerability that real relationships require. And here's the key. Hawkins believed that narcissistic patterns arise when the self is unable to tolerate vulnerability. Social media trains children to avoid vulnerability at all costs. Everything is curated, filtered, optimized. There's no room for imperfection, uncertainty, or authentic emotional expression.
So, does the platform reinforces the very traits Hawkins associated with narcissistic development?
Yes, and not just in individuals who were already vulnerable. The system itself nudges everyone toward those patterns. Emotional intensity is rewarded. Outrage is rewarded. Self promotion is rewarded. If you take Hawkins seriously, then we're not just dealing with individual narcissism, we're dealing with a cultural environment that cultivates narcissistic tendencies on a scale.
That's a striking idea. It suggests that the digital environment isn't just reflecting human psychology, it's shaping it.
Exactly. And that's why I keep coming back to the idea of societal emotional sustainability. If we normalize environments that reward immature emotional strategies, we risk creating a society where emotional maturity becomes the exception rather than the norm. Hawkins believed that emotional development is the foundation for higher states of consciousness, compassion, integrity, empathy. If we undermine that foundation, we undermine the emotional infrastructure of society itself.
Thor, we've talked about the risks, the way algorithmic platforms can undermine emotional development and reinforce the patterns Hawkins warned about. But let's shift toward solutions. What would an emotionally sustainable digital environment look like?
I think the first step is recognizing that digital environments are developmental environments. Once we accept that, the design priorities change. Instead of maximizing engagement, we start asking, what supports emotional maturity? What strengthens the inner self rather than hollowing it out? An emotionally sustainable platform would be built around those questions.
So, what would that mean in practice?
For one, it would mean slowing things down. Hawkins emphasized that emotional growth requires reflection, stillness, and the ability to tolerate discomfort. But current platforms are built on speed, instant reactions, instant feedback, instant stimulation. A healthier system would introduce friction, not punitive friction, but developmental friction. For example, encouraging delayed posting or prompting users to reflect before responding. Even small design choices can shift the emotional tone.
Almost like building a digital version of emotional scaffolding.
Exactly. And it goes deeper. A sustainable platform would avoid exploiting the reward circuitry that keeps people hooked. Instead of dopamine-driven metrics, likes, streaks, view counts, it would emphasize meaningful interaction. Imagine a platform where the most visible content isn't what triggers the strongest reaction, but what fosters understanding, cooperation, or creativity. That's not utopian. It's a design choice.
And it aligns with Hawkins' view that higher states of consciousness emerge when the self is stable and not constantly seeking external validation.
Yes. Hawkins believed that emotional maturity is the foundation for compassion, integrity, and clarity. A digital environment that constantly pulls people outward toward comparison, performance, and reactivity undermines that foundation. A sustainable platform would help people turn inward, not in a self-absorbed way, but in a grounded way. It would support the development of an inner center of gravity.
What about children specifically? What would a child friendly, development supportive platform look like?
It would be built around developmental science, not marketing strategy. For children, that means no algorithmic amplification of emotionally intense content, no metrics that quantify popularity, no infinite scroll, no design features that bypass self-regulation. Instead, it would encourage creativity, exploration, and relational depth. It would help children build neural circuits for patience, frustration tolerance, and reflective thinking, the very capacities that social media currently erodes.
So, the goal isn't to remove technology from childhood, but to redesign it so it supports development rather than short circuiting it.
Exactly. Technology isn't the enemy. The problem is when design choices exploit vulnerabilities instead of supporting growth. Hawkins would say that the purpose of development is to move toward greater emotional integration. A digital environment aligned with that purpose would be one that strengthens the self, not fragments it.
And what about society as a whole? How does emotional sustainability scale?
It scales through culture. When platforms reward empathy, nuance, and cooperation, those qualities become more visible and therefore more valued. When platforms reward outrage, performance, and self promotion, those qualities dominate. An emotionally sustainable digital environment would create a feedback loop that elevates maturity rather than amplifying immaturity. Over time, that shapes not just individuals, but the emotional climate of society.
Thor, this is a powerful vision. It feels both ambitious and deeply necessary.
It is necessary, because if we want a society capable of empathy, resilience, and democratic stability, we must build digital environments that cultivate those qualities. Emotional sustainability isn't a luxury, it's a prerequisite for a healthy future.
Thor, we've talked about adolescence and identity formation, but I want to go even further. You've hinted that the danger of social media algorithms begins long before a child ever touches a screen. Can you explain that?
Absolutely. One of the most overlooked aspects of this whole conversation is that developmental vulnerability doesn't start at age 13 when a kid gets a phone. It starts in the womb. Prenatal stress, especially chronic stress, can shape the architecture of the developing brain. When a pregnant mother is exposed to high stress hormones, the fetus receives those signals. And the areas most affected are the ones responsible for emotional regulation, impulse control, and stress response. So, before a child is even born, their nervous system may already be more sensitive, more reactive, more easily overwhelmed.
And then that child grows up in a digital environment designed to overstimulate those exact systems.
Exactly. It's a perfect storm. A child who is already neurologically sensitive enters a world engineered to trigger the stress response circuitry: fast, bright, unpredictable, emotionally intense content. Social media algorithms don't just show content, they select content that maximizes arousal. That means more novelty, more intensity, more emotional charge. For a developing brain, especially one shaped by prenatal stress, that's like pouring gasoline on a fire.
So, the danger is not just the content itself, but the algorithmic logic behind it.
Right. Algorithms are built to maximize engagement, not well being. And what drives engagement? Emotional reactivity, outrage, fear, excitement, comparison. These are the exact emotional states that a developing child is least equipped to regulate. Hawkins would say these states correspond to lower levels of consciousness, fear, shame, craving, anger, and that staying stuck there prevents emotional maturation.
So, the algorithm keeps the child anchored in the very states that block development.
Yes. Hawkins believed that emotional growth requires moving from reactivity to reflection, from external validation to inner stability. But algorithms do the opposite. They keep the child in a loop of external stimulation, external comparison, external identity construction. And remember, early childhood is when the brain is wiring the systems for self soothing, frustration tolerance, and emotional resilience. If those systems are constantly bypassed, replaced by digital stimulation, they don't develop properly.
It's like the algorithm becomes a substitute for emotional regulation.
Exactly. A child feels bored, anxious, lonely, and instead of learning to navigate those feelings, they get a hit of stimulation. The algorithm becomes the regulator, but it's a regulator with no interest in the child's development. Its only goal is to keep them engaged.
And this starts even before the child is consciously aware of what's happening.
Yes, a toddler doesn't understand algorithms. They just know that the screen gives them intense, fast changing stimuli that hijacks their attention. And here's the developmental tragedy: the parts of the brain responsible for attention, emotional regulation, and executive function are still forming. When those circuits are flooded with algorithmic stimulation, they wire around the stimulation instead of building internal capacity.
So, the algorithm shapes the architecture of the developing mind.
Exactly. And Hawkins would say it shapes the architecture of the developing self, a self that becomes dependent on external input for emotional equilibrium. a self that never learns to sit with discomfort, a self that becomes reactive rather than reflective. That's why I say this isn't just a technological issue, it's a developmental one, and ultimately, it's a societal one.
Because a generation raised on algorithmic regulation becomes a society that struggles with emotional regulation.
Yes, and that affects everything: relationships, politics, public discourse, empathy, cooperation. Emotional immaturity doesn't stay private, it becomes cultural. If we want a society capable of emotional sustainability, we must protect the earliest stages of development from environments that undermine it.
Thor, this is a sobering but incredibly important perspective. I'd like to continue next with how we can realistically intervene at the family level, the policy level, and the design level.
I'm ready, because the solutions are just as structural as the problem, and they start with understanding what development requires.
Thor, earlier you mentioned that developmental vulnerability begins long before a child ever encounters a screen. I'd like to go deeper into that. How does prenatal stress shape the brain in ways that make algorithmic overstimulation especially dangerous later?
It's a crucial question. Prenatal stress isn't just an emotional experience for the mother, it's a biochemical environment for the fetus. When a pregnant woman experiences chronic stress, her body releases elevated levels of cortisol and other stress hormones. These hormones cross the placenta and influence fetal brain development. And the areas most affected are the ones responsible for emotional regulation, impulse control, and stress response: the amygdala, the prefrontal cortex, and the HPA axis. So even before birth, the child's nervous system can become more reactive, more sensitive, and less resilient.
So, is the child entering the world already primed for heightened emotional reactivity?
Exactly. And that's where the digital environment becomes so dangerous. Social media algorithms are designed to maximize engagement by triggering emotional arousal, novelty, intensity, and unpredictability. For a child with a sensitized stress system, that's like being dropped into an environment engineered to hit every vulnerability point. It's not just overstimulation, it's targeted overstimulation.
And this continues into early childhood, when the brain is still wiring its core regulatory systems.
Yes. Early childhood is when the brain is building the neural circuits for self soothing, attention control, frustration tolerance, and emotional resilience. These circuits develop through relational experiences, through co regulation with caregivers, through moments of manageable frustration, through quiet, unstructured time. But when a child is exposed to algorithmic content, fast paced, emotionally charged, unpredictable, those circuits don't get the chance to form properly. The brain learns to expect constant stimulation. It becomes dependent on external input to regulate internal states.
So, does the algorithm become a kind of surrogate regulator?
Exactly. And that's the developmental catastrophe. Instead of learning to regulate from within, the child learns to regulate through the screen. Hawkins would say the self becomes externally anchored, dependent on stimulation, validation, and distraction to maintain emotional equilibrium. And once that pattern is established early, it's incredibly hard to undo.
How does this connect to Hawkins' view of narcissistic development?
Hawkins believed narcissism emerges when the self never develops a stable internal core. When emotional regulation is externalized, when the person relies on others to soothe, validate, or stabilize them, the self becomes fragile. It compensates through control, performance, and reactivity. Now imagine that dynamics start in infancy, not adolescence. Imagine a child whose earliest regulatory experiences come from algorithmic stimulation rather than human connection. That's not just a risk factor, it's a developmental blueprint.
So, the algorithm doesn't just exploit vulnerability, it helps create it.
Yes, and that's what makes this so urgent. We're not just dealing with kids who are addicted to screens. We're dealing with children whose nervous systems are being shaped by systems that reward reactivity and dependence. Prenatal stress sensitizes the system. Early childhood overstimulation entrenches the pattern, and social media algorithms amplify it throughout adolescence.
It's a developmental pipeline.
Exactly. A pipeline that moves from biological vulnerability to psychological fragility to societal instability. Hawkins would say that when a society normalizes emotional immaturity, it loses its capacity for empathy, cooperation, and higher order functioning. And if we don't intervene early, very early, we risk raising a generation whose emotional architecture has been shaped more by algorithms than by human relationships.
Thor, this is profound and unsettling. I'd like to continue next with what meaningful early stage interventions might look like, both at home and at the policy level.
I'm ready. Because the solutions must be as early, as structural, and as intentional as the forces shaping the problem.
Thor, we've talked about the biological and psychological aspects of early development, but I'd like to go deeper into the philosophical side. How does Hawkins' consciousness model help us understand what's happening to children in the digital age?
Hawkins believed that consciousness evolves through identifiable stages, from fear and shame at the bottom, through courage and integrity in the middle, and toward compassion, love, and clarity at the higher levels. What's important is that he saw these levels not as abstract spiritual ideas, but as developmental realities. A child doesn't start at higher levels, they grow into them. And that growth depends on emotional regulation, relational safety, and the gradual strengthening of the inner self. Without those foundations, the self can't stabilize enough to move upward.
So, consciousness development is inseparable from emotional development.
Exactly. Hawkins saw emotional maturity as the scaffolding for higher consciousness. You can't access compassion if you're stuck in chronic fear. You can't access integrity if your identity is fragile. You can't access clarity if your nervous system is constantly overstimulated. And this is where the digital environment becomes so disruptive. Social media algorithms keep children anchored in the lower levels: fear, craving, comparison, reactivity. These states are profitable because they keep people engaged, but they're developmentally regressive.
So, the algorithm doesn't just distract, it arrests development.
Yes, Hawkins would say it interrupts the natural upward movement of consciousness. A child who might otherwise grow into courage, curiosity, and empathy gets pulled back into fear, insecurity, and external validation. And remember, early development is when the foundation is laid. If the foundation is built on overstimulation and emotional volatility, the higher levels of consciousness, the ones Hawkins associated with wisdom, compassion, and inner stability, become much harder to reach.
How does prenatal stress fit into this philosophical model?
Prenatal stress sensitizes the nervous system. It makes the child more reactive, more easily overwhelmed, more prone to fear-based states. In Hawkins' model, that means the child starts life closer to the lower levels of consciousness, not because of moral failure, but because of neurobiology. Then, if that child grows up in an environment dominated by algorithmic overstimulation, those lower level states get reinforced. Fear becomes familiar. Craving becomes normal. Comparison becomes constant. The child's consciousness becomes anchored in survival mode.
And survival mode is the opposite of growth mode.
Exactly. Growth requires safety. It requires stillness. It requires the ability to sit with discomfort without collapsing. Hawkins believed that the self must become internally coherent before it can expand. But the digital environment fragments itself. It pulls attention outward. It replaces inner experience with external metrics. It rewards emotional volatility over emotional depth. So instead of moving upward on the consciousness scale, the child becomes stuck, not because they lack potential, but because the environment keeps them in a perpetual state of reactivity.
It's almost like the algorithm becomes a philosophical force, shaping not just behavior, but the trajectory of consciousness itself.
Yes, and that's why this conversation matters so much. We're not just talking about screen time or attention span. We're talking about the evolution of the human self. If we allow algorithms to dominate early development, we risk creating a generation whose consciousness is shaped more by stimulation than by reflection, more by fear than by courage, more by comparison than by compassion.
And that has implications far beyond childhood.
Absolutely. Hawkins believed that the collective consciousness of a society is the sum of the consciousness of its individuals. If individuals are stuck in reactivity, society becomes reactive. If individuals are anchored in fear, society becomes fearful. So, when we talk about protecting early development, we're not just protecting children. We're protecting the emotional and philosophical future of society itself.
Thor, this is profound. I'd like to continue next with how we can practically apply this philosophical understanding to redesign digital environments, not just for safety, but for the evolution of consciousness.
I'd love that. Because the real question isn't just what we're protecting children from, it's what we're helping them grow into.
Thor, I want to go deeper into neuroscience. We've talked about prenatal stress and early vulnerability, but how exactly do social media algorithms interact with the developing brain? What's happening at the level of neural architecture?
To understand that, we must start with a basic fact. A child's brain is not a finished product. It's a construction site, and the blueprint is shaped by experience. During infancy and early childhood, the brain is wiring the systems responsible for attention, emotional regulation, impulse control, and social understanding. These systems depend on predictable, attuned, relational input. They grow through co-regulation, through the slow, rhythmic dance between caregiver and child. But social media algorithms deliver the opposite: rapid, unpredictable, high-intensity stimulation. And the developing brain adapts to whatever environment it's exposed to.
So, does the brain literally wire itself around the algorithmic environment?
Exactly. Neural circuits strengthen through repetition. If a child repeatedly experiences fast-paced, emotionally charged content, the brain learns to expect that level of stimulation. The dopamine system becomes hypersensitive. The attention system becomes fragmented. The stress response system becomes overactive. And here's the key: the prefrontal cortex, the part of the brain responsible for self-regulation, empathy, and long-term thinking, is the slowest to develop. It's still under construction well into the mid-20s. Algorithms target the limbic system, the emotional brain, bypassing the prefrontal cortex entirely. So, the child's emotional circuitry gets overstimulated while the regulatory circuitry remains underdeveloped.
That sounds like a recipe for emotional instability.
It is. And Hawkins would say it's also a recipe for narcissistic development, not in the colloquial sense of vanity, but in the deeper sense of a self that never forms a stable internal core. When the limbic system dominates and the prefrontal cortex lags, the child becomes reactive rather than reflective. They seek external stimulation to regulate internal discomfort. They depend on others or on the algorithm to stabilize their emotional state. That's the psychological soil in which narcissistic patterns grow.
So, the algorithm doesn't just influence behavior, it shapes the architecture of the self.
Yes, and it does so at the most vulnerable stages of development. Let me break it down. Infants learn regulation through human connection, tone of voice, eye contact, predictable rhythms. Algorithmic content disrupts this by providing intense stimulation without relational meaning. The brain learns to regulate through external intensity rather than internal stability. Toddlers develop sustained attention through exploration and play. Algorithms fragment attention by delivering rapid, high-novelty stimuli. The brain becomes wired for distraction. Children form a sense of self through relational mirroring, being seen, understood, and responded to. Algorithms replace relational mirroring with performance metrics, likes, views, reactions. The self becomes externally constructed. Empathy develops through slow, reciprocal interactions. Algorithms reward emotional intensity, not emotional nuance. The brain becomes conditioned to react, not to understand.
And all of this aligns with Hawkins' idea that narcissism is a developmental arrest, a self stuck in external dependence.
Exactly. Hawkins believed that narcissistic patterns emerge when the self never internalizes stability, when emotional regulation is outsourced, when identity is built on performance rather than authenticity. Social media algorithms create those conditions on a scale. They train the brain to seek validation, to avoid vulnerability, to depend on external metrics for self-worth. It's not that the algorithm creates narcissism. It creates developmental conditions in which narcissistic patterns become adaptive.
So, the danger is not just psychological, it's neurological.
Yes, and that's what makes this so urgent. We're not just shaping behavior, we're shaping neural architecture. We are shaping the emotional blueprint of a generation. If the brain learns to regulate through stimulation rather than connection, the self becomes fragile. If the brain learns to seek validation rather than meaning, the self becomes performative. If the brain learns to react rather than reflect, the self becomes volatile. That's the neuropsychological pathway to a narcissistic mind, not as a moral failing, but as a developmental outcome.
Thor, this is profound. I'd like to continue next with how we can intervene, how we can redesign environments, both digital and relational, to support healthy neural and psychological development.
I'm ready. Because the solutions exist, but they require us to rethink what childhood needs and what technology should be allowed to shape.
Thor, we've talked about how early overstimulation and algorithmic environments can set the stage for narcissistic patterns. But I want to go deeper. What intensifies these traits as a child grows, all the way into late adolescence?
To answer that, we need to look at three layers. First, the neurobiology of the developing brain. Second, the psychological architecture of the self. Third, the algorithmic environment that reinforces certain traits. When these three layers interact in the wrong way, they create a developmental trajectory that aligns almost perfectly with what Hawkins described as the narcissistic self, a self that is externally anchored, emotionally reactive, and dependent on validation.
Let's start with neurobiology. What's happening in the brain?
The brain develops unevenly. The emotional centers, especially the amygdala, mature early. The prefrontal cortex, which handles self-regulation, empathy, long-term thinking, and impulse control, doesn't fully mature until the mid-20s. This creates a natural developmental imbalance. High emotional intensity, low regulatory capacity. Now add algorithmic stimulation, fast, intense, unpredictable, emotionally charged content. The amygdala gets constant activation. The dopamine system gets hijacked. The prefrontal cortex gets bypassed. This imbalance intensifies narcissistic tendencies because the child learns to regulate emotion through external stimulation rather than internal stability.
So, the brain becomes wired for reactivity instead of reflection.
Exactly. And that's the first ingredient of narcissistic development, a reactive emotional system with weak internal regulation.
What about the psychological side? How does the self-get architecture get shaped in this environment?
The self develops through mirroring, through being seen, understood, and responded to by caregivers. This builds what psychologists call secure attachment and what Hawkins would call inner coherence. But when a child grows up in a digital environment, the mirroring becomes distorted. Instead of relational feedback, they get algorithmic feedback. Instead of being valued for who they are, they're valued for how they perform. This creates a self that is externally constructed, performance-based, dependent on validation, terrified of vulnerability. These are the psychological hallmarks of narcissistic development.
So, the child learns, I am what others see, not who I am inside.
Exactly. And that belief becomes stronger with age, especially during adolescence, when identity formation is at its peak.
Why is adolescence such a critical period for intensifying narcissistic trait storms?
Because adolescence is the moment when three forces collide. First, neurological volatility. The emotional brain is hypersensitive. The regulatory brain is still under construction. Second, identity formation. Teens are asking, who am I? How do others see me? What makes me valuable? Third, algorithmic reinforcement. Platforms reward self-promotion, emotional intensity. outrage, comparison, performance. This is the perfect storm. The adolescent brain is primed for external validation, and the algorithm delivers it in endless supply.
So the algorithm becomes the architect of identity.
Yes, and it intensifies narcissistic traits in several ways. First, hyper-focus on appearance and performance. Likes and views become proxies for self-worth. Second, emotional volatility. Algorithms amplify content that triggers strong emotions, anger, envy, excitement, reinforcing reactivity. Third, social comparison. Teens compare themselves to idealized images, creating insecurity and compensatory self-inflation. Fourth, fear of vulnerability. Authenticity becomes risky. Curated identity becomes safe. Fifth, external regulation. The teen learns to soothe anxiety through scrolling, posting, or seeking attention. These are the exact conditions Hawkins described as the foundation of narcissistic consciousness, a self that cannot regulate from within and therefore depends on external reinforcement.
What happens as a teen approaches adulthood, late teenage years?
By late adolescence, neural pathways are becoming more stable. Patterns of emotional regulation, attention, and identity are consolidating. If the teens have spent years in an algorithmic environment, the brain has been trained to seek stimulation, avoid discomfort, depending on validation, react impulsively, construct identity externally. These patterns become traits, and traits become personality tendencies. This is how a narcissistic pattern, in Hawkins' sense, becomes solidified.
So the danger isn't that social media creates narcissists, but that it creates the developmental conditions in which narcissistic traits become adaptive.
Exactly. It's not moral failure. It's neurodevelopmental conditioning. And the tragedy is that these traits, reactivity, insecurity, external dependence, are not signs of strength. They're signs of a self that never got the chance to develop from the inside out.
Part 13, interrupting the trajectory. How to build inner stability in a digital age. Thor, this is incredibly illuminating. I'd like to continue next with how we can interrupt this trajectory, how we can help children and teens build the inner stability that Hawkins believed was essential for higher consciousness.
I'm ready. Because the solutions are real, but they require us to rethink what childhood, adolescence, and digital environments are supposed to support.
Let's start at the beginning. What does it mean to rethink childhood?
It means recognizing that childhood is not a waiting room for adulthood. It's the construction phase of the entire emotional architecture. Hawkins believed that higher consciousness depends on inner coherence, and inner coherence depends on early emotional regulation. So, the first intervention is simple but profound. Children need relational rhythms, not algorithmic rhythms. They need predictable routines, attuned caregivers, slow, reciprocal interactions, unstructured play, boredom, silence. These experiences strengthen the prefrontal cortex, the part of the brain that anchors the self. Without them, the child becomes dependent on external stimulation.
So, the antidote to algorithmic overstimulation is relational attunement.
Exactly. A child who learns to regulate through human connection becomes less vulnerable to algorithmic manipulation later.
What about school-age children? How do we support them?
This is the age when children learn to tolerate frustration, navigate conflict, and build empathy. But digital environments often short-circuit these skills. So, we need to teach children something Hawkins emphasized: the ability to sit with discomfort without collapsing into reactivity. That means teaching emotional vocabulary, modeling calm responses, encouraging problem solving instead of distraction, limiting algorithmic content that rewards emotional intensity. Children need to learn that feelings are not emergencies. They're signals, and signals can be understood, not escaped.
That's a powerful reframe.
It's essential because narcissistic patterns grow when discomfort becomes intolerable. If a child never learns to hold difficult emotions, they will always seek external regulation from people or from algorithms.
Let's move into adolescence. This seems like the most fragile stage.
It is. Adolescence is the crucible of identity. And right now, identity formation is happening inside systems designed to reward performance, comparison, and emotional volatility. To interrupt the trajectory, we need to help teens build what Hawkins called an inner axis, a sense of self that isn't dependent on external validation. That means teaching media literacy as emotional literacy, helping teens understand how algorithms manipulate attention, encouraging offline identity exploration, creating spaces where vulnerability is safe, reducing the emphasis on metrics, likes, views, followers. Teens need to learn that identity is something you discover, not something you perform.
So, the goal is to help them shift from external anchoring to internal anchoring.
Exactly. A teen who knows who they are inside is far less vulnerable to algorithmic shaping.
And what about the digital environment itself? How do we redesign it?
We start by asking a radical question. What if technology were designed to support development instead of exploiting vulnerability? That would mean slowing down content delivery, reducing emotional intensity, eliminating metrics for children, prioritizing meaningful interaction over engagement, designing algorithms that elevate nuance, not outrage, creating digital spaces that reward reflection, not reactivity. In other words, we build platforms that align with the developmental trajectory of the brain, not the business model of engagement.
That's a profound shift.
It is. But it's necessary. Because right now, the digital environment is shaping consciousness downward toward fear, craving, comparison, and reactivity. Hawkins believed that consciousness could evolve upward toward courage, integrity, compassion, and clarity, but only if the self is stable enough to grow. Our job is to create environments that support that stability.
If you had to summarize the entire intervention in one principle, what would it be?
Strengthen the inner world before exposing the child to the outer one. A child with emotional regulation, secure attachment, reflective capacity, a sense of self, tolerance for discomfort, is resilient. They can navigate digital environments without losing themselves. A child without those foundations becomes vulnerable to the algorithmic pull toward narcissistic patterns, not because they're selfish, but because they're unanchored.
Before we close part one, I want to come back to the title, The Inner Child. After everything we've discussed, algorithms, development, vulnerability, what do you want people to understand about that inner child?
I want people to understand that the inner child is not a metaphor. It's a living developmental reality. It's the part of us that learns how to feel safe in the world, how to regulate emotion, how to know who we are without needing constant confirmation from others. When that inner child is protected, supported, and allowed to mature, the adult self becomes stable, empathetic, and resilient. But when that inner child is overwhelmed by stress, by neglect, or by environments that exploit vulnerability, the self never fully anchors. And what worries me is that algorithm-driven systems are interacting not with adults, but with unfinished nervous systems.
So, the danger isn't just distraction, it's interruption.
Exactly. Interruption of emotional development. Interruption of self-formation. Interruption of the slow, necessary process of learning how to be with oneself. The inner child needs boredom. It needs frustration. It needs silence. It needs human attitude. But algorithms offer the opposite. Constant stimulation, instant relief, external validation. They teach the child, implicitly, don't feel, scroll.
And that lesson follows them into adulthood.
Yes, a society is only as mature as the inner children it raises. If we teach children that discomfort is something to escape rather than understand, we raise adults who cannot tolerate complexity, disagreement, or vulnerability. This isn't about nostalgia. It's about developmental truth. The inner child is the foundation of emotional adulthood, and right now, that foundation is being shaped by systems that were never designed with human development in mind.
So, part one is really about awareness.
It is. Awareness that childhood is not just a personal phase, it's a public responsibility. Awareness that technology is not neutral when it enters the nervous system of a developing human. And awareness that protecting the inner child is not about limiting freedom, it's about safeguarding the conditions that allow freedom to emerge later.
Thor, thank you. This has been profound.
Thank you. And I hope viewers carry this one question with them.
The next chapter of this interview, Algorithm Driven Social Media, Part 2, Our Responsibility as a Society, shifts the focus from individual development to the broader societal impact of technology. It explores how collective choices and cultural norms shape the environment in which children mature, especially as algorithmic platforms influence public discourse, values, and behaviors. This section will challenge readers to consider not only what is happening within each child, but also what kind of society we are constructing when technological systems interact with our most vulnerable members. Ultimately, it calls for a conscious examination of our shared duty to foster healthy conditions for all, recognizing that the consequences of algorithm driven media extend far beyond personal screens into the fabric of community life.